She crossed 1,000 miles of dust and danger to marry a man she'd never met. And when she finally arrived, he didn't want her. Neither did the second. The third never even bothered to show his face. Mara Whitlock stood in the middle of Red Hollow with nothing but a torn dress and a name no one cared to remember. 3 rejections in one day. No money, no way home. No one coming to save her. But what happened next? What she did with the ruins of her dignity changed everything. Stay with me until the end. If this story reaches you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I can see just how far this journey has traveled. The stagecoach rattled to a halt in front of a building that barely qualified as a depot. More of a lean-to with ambitions. The driver didn't bother climbing down, just called out Red Hollow like he was announcing a funeral and went back to picking at something between his teeth. Mara Whitlock gathered her skirt in one hand and her single carpet bag in the other, and she stepped down onto ground so dry it cracked under her boots like old bones. The air tasted like iron and sage, and something faintly rotten drifting from the stock pens 2 streets over. This was the town. This was the place she'd pinned every last hope to. It looked like hope had died here a long time ago. Red Hollow sat in a shallow valley ringed by brown hills that weren't tall enough to be impressive and weren't short enough to ignore. The main street ran maybe 300 yards before it gave up and turned to scrubland. There was a general store with a porch that sagged on the left side, a saloon with no name on its sign, a blacksmith, a feedlot, and a squat building with land office, painted across the front in letters that were peeling so badly you could barely read them. A handful of horses stood tied to rails with their heads low in the heat, tails swishing at flies. She'd come from Pennsylvania, from green hills and river fog and the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings. She'd sold everything, her mother's sewing machine, her father's watch, every last stick of furniture from the house that wasn't hers anymore after the bank took it. All of it converted into a one-way ticket and 3 letters in her coat pocket. 3 letters from 3 different men, each one promising her a home, a future, a marriage. She touched the pocket now, feeling the edges of the paper through the fabric. Her fingers were trembling. She told herself it was the heat. The first letter was from a man named Harold Sutter. He'd written her 4 times over the span of 2 months. Good penmanship. Talked about his dry goods store, his plans to expand, how he was looking for a wife who could keep accounts and wasn't afraid of hard work. He'd sounded solid, dependable. He'd said he'd be waiting at the depot. The depot was empty except for a stray dog lying in a sliver of shade. Mara looked left, looked right, pulled the letter out and read the address again. Sutter Dry Goods, Main Street, Red Hollow. She could see the store from where she was standing. The windows were dark. "Excuse me," she said to the stagecoach driver. He was already turning the horses. "Sir, do you know where I might find Harold Sutter?" The driver gave her a look that wasn't quite pity, but was in the neighborhood. "Sutter's place is right there, but I wouldn't get your hopes up." "What does that mean?" He shrugged, cracked the reins, and the coach lurched away, leaving her in a cloud of tan dust that settled on her dress and in her hair and on her eyelashes. She blinked it away, picked up her bag, walked toward the store. The door was unlocked. A bell jangled overhead when she pushed it open. Inside, it was dim and cluttered. Barrels of flour and sugar lined up along one wall, shelves of canned goods and tools, bolts of fabric stacked haphazardly on a table. Behind the counter stood a man in his 40s with a round face and thinning hair and an apron that had seen better decades. "Mr. Sutter?" He looked up. Something moved across his face. Recognition, then alarm, then a kind of pained embarrassment that he tried to cover by adjusting his apron strings. You're the woman from Pennsylvania." "Mara Whitlock. We've been corresponding." Yes, I know who you are." He wouldn't meet her eyes. He picked up a tin can from the counter, put it down, picked it up again. "Miss Whitlock, I need to tell you something, and I'm afraid there's no gentle way to put it." Her stomach dropped. Not all at once. More like a slow leak, the way a tire goes flat over miles of bad road. She knew, she already knew. But she stood there and let him say it because what else could she do? "I've gotten engaged," Harold Sutter said. "To someone else. A woman from town. It happened fast, and I should have written to tell you, but I kept putting it off, and then I figured you probably wouldn't come all this way anyway, and I did come all this way." "I see that." Silence. The clock on the wall ticked. A fly buzzed against the window. "When?" Mara asked. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, flat, like something pressed between heavy books. About 3 weeks ago. Her name's Ruth Ann Briggs. Her father owns the feedlot. He finally looked at her. I'm sorry, I truly am. You seem like a fine woman, and You could have written one letter. I know. One letter, Mr. Sutter, that's all it would have taken. He opened his mouth, closed it, nodded. You're right. I was a coward about it. I won't pretend otherwise. Mara picked up her bag. Her hand was steady. She would not let it shake in front of this man. The second gentleman who wrote me, Thomas Garvey. Do you know where I can find him? Sutter pointed vaguely. Garvey Farm. About 2 miles east. Past the creek bed. She walked out without thanking him. The bell jangled again, and the sound felt like it was mocking her. 2 miles in this heat with a carpetbag felt like 20. She kept to the side of the road where there was occasional shade from scraggly trees that leaned like tired old men. Sweat ran down her back. Her boots raised small explosions of dust with every step. She passed a woman hanging laundry who stared at her without speaking. She passed a boy herding goats who looked at her dress, city dress, completely wrong for this landscape, and snickered. By the time she reached the Garvey property, she was lightheaded and her lips were cracked and she'd drunk the last of her water a mile back. The farmhouse was nicer than she'd expected, whitewashed, with a real porch and a garden that someone was actually tending. She knocked. Thomas Garvey answered the door. He was younger than Sutter, maybe 30, with broad shoulders and a sunburned face and the kind of jaw that looked carved out of something stubborn. Miss Whitlock? Mr. Garvey. He didn't invite her in. He stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind him, which told her everything she needed to know before he said a word. I got your last letter, he said. I was going to write back. But you didn't. No. He rubbed the back of his neck. Behind him, through the window, she could see movement. An older woman in a dark dress watching from inside. My mother arrived last month, from Missouri. She has opinions about things. About me. About a woman she's never met coming out here to marry her son. She wants me to marry locally, someone she knows, someone she can... He stopped. Had the decency to look ashamed. I can't go against her on this. She's all the family I've got. Mara stared at him. She felt something building behind her eyes. Not tears, not yet. Something harder than tears. Anger, maybe. Or the beginning of a despair so complete it almost felt like calm. Did you mean any of it? She asked. The letters, the things you wrote about wanting a partner, a companion, someone who wasn't afraid of frontier life. I meant every word. Then what changed? He looked at the ground. My mother. The door opened behind him. The older woman appeared, broke, thin, sharp-faced, with her hair pulled back so tight it seemed to be holding her expression in place. She looked at Mara the way you look at a stain on a tablecloth. Thomas, your lunch is getting cold. Yes, ma'am. He didn't apologize. Didn't offer her water or a ride back to town. Just nodded once and disappeared inside. The door closed with a click that felt permanent. Mara stood on that porch for a full minute. Stood there looking at the closed door and the neat little garden and the clean white house where she was not wanted and would never be welcome. Then she turned and walked back toward Red Hollow with the sun burning the back of her neck and the road stretching out in front of her like a sentence with no end. The third man was named William Pratt. His letter had been the shortest but in some ways the most earnest. He'd written about loneliness in a way that felt genuine, about the silence of living alone, about wanting someone to share meals with, about how he'd cleared out a room in his house and put a wildflower bouquet on the dresser in anticipation of her arrival. She'd read that letter so many times the creases were wearing through. He was supposed to meet her at the saloon at 4 o'clock. She arrived at 1:45, sat at a table by the window with her carpetbag at her feet and her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. She ordered a glass of water because that was all she could afford. Actually, she couldn't even afford that. But the barkeep took one look at her face and brought it without charge. 4 o'clock came. 4:15. 4:30. You waiting on someone, miss? The barkeep asked. He was a big man with kind eyes and a mustache that curved down past his chin. William Pratt. Do you know him? Something in the barkeep's face shifted. Not pity exactly, something more complicated. Pratt left town. 4 days ago. Packed up and headed for California. Didn't tell too many people. The water glass was halfway to her lips. She set it down very carefully, as if it might break. California. Yes, ma'am. He knew I was coming. The barkeep wiped the counter with a rag that was dirtier than the counter. I expect he did. She sat there. The saloon filled slowly with the evening crowd. Men in work clothes, hats pushed back, talking about cattle prices and weather and the creek that was running low again. A few of them noticed her. A woman sitting alone in a saloon wasn't the kind of thing that went unnoticed in a town like Red Hollow. She heard the whispers start within the hour. Small town. Word traveled faster than wind. That's the mail order woman. 3 men, and not a single one. Can you blame them? Look at her. Must be something wrong with... Sutter's the smart one. Ruth Ann's got a dowry at least. Pratt ran all the way to California. That's how badly She heard every word. They weren't even trying to be quiet about it. A group of men at the bar were openly laughing, not at a joke, but at her. At the spectacle of a woman who'd crossed half the country for a wedding and ended up sitting alone in a saloon with a glass of free water and nowhere to sleep. The barkeep, his name was Finnegan, though she wouldn't learn that until later, leaned over and spoke low. Miss, you got anywhere to stay tonight? No. The boarding house might have a room. Mrs. Cole runs it. Tell her Finn sent you. I don't have money for a room. He studied her for a moment. Then he reached under the counter and brought out a key on a leather cord. There's a storeroom out back. It's clean enough. Got a cot. You can stay tonight, and we'll figure something out in the morning. I don't take charity. It's not charity. I need someone to sweep the porch tomorrow. Call it wages in advance. She looked at the key. Looked at him. Her eyes were burning, but she would not cry. Not in this saloon. Not in front of these men who thought her failure was entertainment. Thank you, she said, and picked up the key. The storeroom smelled like old barley and lamp oil. The cot had a thin blanket that had been washed so many times it was more holes than fabric. She lay down on it fully dressed, with her carpet bag clutched against her chest like a child holding a stuffed animal, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the saloon through the wall. The laughter, the clink of glasses, the scuff of boots on wooden floors. She was 26 years old. She had no family left, no money, no prospects, and no way home. She was in a town that already thought of her as a joke. The mail-order bride nobody wanted. The woman who got rejected 3 times in one day. By morning, every person in Red Hollow would know her story. By next week, it would be the kind of tale people told to amuse themselves during long winters. She did not cry. She lay there dry-eyed and rigid and thought about all the decisions that had brought her to this cot in this storeroom in this forgotten little town, and she could not find a single moment where she'd done the wrong thing. She'd been practical. She'd been brave. She'd taken the only path available to her after the bank took the house and the factory closed and there was nothing left in Scranton except debts she couldn't pay and a life she couldn't build alone. And none of it had mattered. None of her planning, none of her courage, none of her careful letter writing, or her weeks of travel, or her willingness to start over in a place she'd never seen. She'd done everything right, and the world had handed her this. Sleep came eventually, but it was thin and restless and full of half-formed dreams about trains and empty houses and doors closing. Morning arrived with dust motes and the sound of somebody banging pots around in the saloon kitchen. Mara sat up, smoothed her dress as best she could, splashed water on her face from a basin in the corner, and went out to sweep the porch as promised. The main street was quiet at this hour. A few people moved between buildings. A woman carrying a basket, a man leading a mule. They looked at Mara. She looked back. Nobody spoke. She swept the porch with a thoroughness that bordered on aggression, pushing the broom into every corner, every crack between boards, as if she could sweep away her humiliation along with the dust. When she finished, Finnegan brought her coffee and a biscuit and sat on the porch rail while she ate. "You got any skills?" he asked. "Besides sweeping, which you're unreasonably good at. I can keep books. I can sew. I can cook, though not fancy. I can read and write, obviously." She paused. "I can manage a household. That's what I came here to do." "Housekeeping, you mean?" "Managing. There's a difference." He smiled a little. "Fair point." He sipped his coffee. "Look, I know this isn't my business, but Red Hollow isn't exactly overflowing with opportunities for a single woman. The boarding house might need help, but Mrs. Cole doesn't pay worth a damn. The school needs a teacher, but the committee already hired some preacher's daughter from Boise." I'm not looking for a job, Mr. Finnegan. I'm looking for a plan. Finn. Just Finn. He scratched his mustache. Well, there is one other thing. Probably nothing. Probably a terrible idea. Tell me anyway. Man came in yesterday, before you arrived. Name's Elias Mercer, rancher. Got a spread about 8 miles north of town, up against the foothills. Big place, or it used to be. Been falling apart since his wife died. Mara stopped eating. How long ago? Year and a half, maybe 2. Fever took her. Same one that swept through the valley back in '86. He's got 2 kids. Girl about 9, boy about 12. And from what I hear, the ranch is in trouble. Cattle getting thin, fences falling down, house is a mess. He can't do it alone, and the kids aren't old enough to carry a full load. What does this have to do with me? Finn hesitated. He was in here asking, not asking exactly, more like thinking out loud after a couple of whiskeys, about finding someone, a woman. Not for romance, he was real clear about that. Someone practical, someone who could run a house and help with the children and maybe keep the books for the ranch. He said he'd offer marriage for the legal protection, property rights and such. But it would be a business arrangement, nothing more. Mara set the biscuit down. She felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope, nothing that fragile. More like recognition, the way you feel when you see a road you didn't know was there. Is he a good man? That I honestly can't tell you. He's not a bad one, near as I can figure. Keeps to himself, pays his debts. Doesn't drink much, which says something given what he's been through. The kids are having a hard time. The girl barely talks, and the boy's got a chip on his shoulder the size of this porch. And you think he'd consider me? I think a man who's desperate enough to talk about marriage to a bartender might consider just about anyone. No offense. None taken. She picked up the biscuit again, ate it slowly, thinking, where do I find him? He'll be in town today, supply run. He usually ties up by the feedlot around midday. What does he look like? Tall, dark hair going gray at the sides. Looks like he hasn't slept properly in about 2 years, which he probably hasn't. And his eyes, I don't know how to describe it. He looks at you like he's already expecting the worst. Mara nodded. I know that look. She spent the rest of the morning in the storeroom, doing what she could with her appearance. She washed her face and hands twice, brushed her hair until it hurt, mended a tear in her sleeve with thread borrowed from Finn's kitchen, and pressed the worst wrinkles out of her dress using a heated pan and a damp cloth. She didn't look good. She looked like a woman who'd traveled hard and been beaten down and was trying her best, which was exactly what she was. At noon, she walked to the feedlot. He was there, tall, like Finn said, lean in a way that suggested he'd been thicker once, before the grief ate away at him. His hat was pulled low, but she could see the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw, locked tight, the way men held their faces when they were carrying something they couldn't put down. He was loading sacks of grain into the back of a wagon, while a man from the feedlot watched and occasionally said something that Elias Mercer did not respond to. She walked up to the wagon. He didn't notice her at first. She had to say his name twice. Mr. Mercer. He stopped, straightened, looked at her with eyes that were gray-green like river water over stones, and exactly as Finn had described them, braced for damage. I don't believe we've met, he said. We haven't. My name is Mara Whitlock. I arrived in town yesterday. She watched him place her. It only took a second. She could see the moment the town gossip connected in his mind. The mail order woman, the 3 rejections. She could see him deciding what to do with that information, and she spoke before he could decide wrong. Mr. Finnegan at the saloon mentioned that you're in need of help at your ranch. I'd like to discuss that with you. His expression didn't change. If anything, it closed further, like a door being pulled tighter against a draft. Finn talks too much. He talks the right amount. He told me you have 2 children and a ranch that's struggling and that you're looking for a practical arrangement. Marriage in name, partnership, in fact. He told you all that. He did. And you just walked over here. I did. A beat. He pulled off his hat, ran a hand through hair that needed cutting, put the hat back on. Up close, she could see a scar along his left jaw, thin and white, and the calluses on his hands, and the way his shirt hung on him like it had been bought for a bigger man. He looked worn down to the frame. Not broken. There was too much stubbornness in the way he stood for that, but close. Miss Whitlock, I appreciate the directness, but you should know that what I'm offering isn't It's not a rescue. It's not going to fix whatever happened to you yesterday. The ranch is hard work. The kids are harder. And I'm not easy to live with. I haven't been easy to live with in a long time. I'm not looking for easy, Mr. Mercer. I'm looking for honest. That landed somewhere. She could see it hit. His jaw moved, and he looked away, out toward the brown hills, and for a moment she thought he was going to tell her to leave. How old are you? He asked. 26. You got any experience with children? I helped raise my younger sister's 3 boys after she passed. Taught them to read, cook, mend clothes, kept them in line when they didn't want to be kept. Can you keep accounts? Better than most men I've met. He almost smiled. Almost. It got about halfway there and then collapsed, like a structure that couldn't hold its own weight. You know anything about cattle? Not a thing, but I learned fast and I'm not afraid of animals. It's not the animals you need to be afraid of. It's the winters, the isolation. Being 8 miles from the nearest neighbor with nothing but hills and wind for company. He studied her. Really looked at her now, not with suspicion, but with something more careful. Assessment, like a man checking the soundness of a beam before trusting it to hold weight. Why would you agree to something like this? After what happened yesterday, most women would be trying to get on the next coach out of here. There is no next coach. Not for 3 weeks. And even if there was, I don't have anywhere to go back to. That's not a reason to marry a stranger. No, it's not. But here's one. I came out here to build a life. The men I was supposed to build it with turned out to be useless. That doesn't change what I came here to do. You need someone who can help you hold your ranch together and take care of your children. I need a place where my work means something. That seems like a fair trade to me. He was quiet for a long time. The feedlot man had wandered off. A horse somewhere stamped and snorted. The sun was directly overhead now, hammering down on everything without mercy. My daughter's name is Clara, he said finally. She's 9. She stopped talking after her mother died. Not completely. She'll say a few words here and there, to me or to her brother, but mostly she's gone quiet. The doctor says it's grief, says she'll come out of it when she's ready. And your son? Jonah? He's 12. He's angry. At me, at the world, at his mother for leaving, though he'd never admit that last part. He's been doing a man's work since he was 10, and it's made him hard in ways a 12-year-old shouldn't be hard. How's he going to feel about a stranger moving into his house? Elias looked at her directly. He's going to hate it. At least you're honest. That's the only thing I've got left to offer. He hefted the last grain sack into the wagon. If we do this, and I'm not saying we are yet, there's some things you need to understand. You'd have your own room, your own space. It wouldn't be a real marriage. Not in that way. It's a legal arrangement. You get the protections that come with being a wife. Property rights, standing in the community, a roof that doesn't leak most of the time. In return, you help me run the household and look after the children. And the ranch? If you want to help with ranch business, I won't stop you. But the cattle work is mine. The books, the household, the children. That's where I need someone. Mara looked at him. Looked at the wagon, the tired horses, the road leading north out of town. Thought about the storeroom that smelled like barley. Thought about the 3 letters in her pocket, each one a promise that had turned to dust. When? She asked. There's a justice of the peace in town. We could do it today, this afternoon. Today. I know it's fast, but I've got to get back to the ranch before dark, and if we're doing this, I'd rather not make 2 trips. She almost laughed. The practicality of it was so complete, so utterly stripped of romance, that it circled all the way around to being almost comforting. No pretense, no sweet talk, no promises that would turn hollow in the morning. Just a man with a problem and a woman with nothing to lose making a deal in front of a feedlot. All right, she said. Today. The justice of the peace was a man named Horace Trimble, who operated out of the back of the land office and smelled like pipe tobacco and dusty paper. He married them in under 5 minutes. Mara signed her name in a leather-bound registry next to Elias's signature, which was cramped and left-leaning, like a man who'd learned to write in a hurry and never went back to improve it. There were no witnesses except the land office clerk, a young man who looked uncomfortable and kept clearing his throat. There were no flowers, no music, no kiss. When Horace said, "You may kiss the bride," Elias looked at Mara and Mara looked at Elias, and they both just sort of nodded, and that was that. They loaded her carpetbag into the wagon alongside the grain sacks. Elias offered her a hand up to the bench seat, and she took it. His grip was rough and calloused and immediately released. They rode north in silence for the first 2 miles. The road climbed gradually, following the contour of the valley floor as it narrowed toward the foothills. The landscape was spare and enormous, sage and bunch grass, and the occasional twisted pine, with mountains rising pale blue in the distance. Hawks circled overhead in wide, lazy loops. The wagon creaked and swayed over ruts that had baked into the road like bones in dried mud. "The children don't know," Elias said eventually. Mara looked at him. "You didn't tell them?" "I didn't know there'd be anything to tell until an hour ago." "That's going to be a problem." "I know." "What are you going to say?" "The truth. That I found someone to help us. That we're married. That it's a practical decision." "And if Jonah doesn't accept that?" Elias's hands tightened on the reins. "Jonah doesn't accept much of anything these days, but he doesn't have to accept it. He has to live with it." "That's a terrible approach." He glanced at her. "You've been my wife for 20 minutes and you're already telling me I'm wrong? If you wanted someone who'd nod along and keep quiet, you married the wrong woman." For the first time, something that might have been genuine amusement crossed his face. It was gone almost instantly, buried under the weight he carried, but she saw it. A flicker. Proof that somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the grief and the stubbornness, there was still a living man. The ranch appeared as the road crested a final rise. It was bigger than she'd expected. A 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a large barn, several outbuildings, and corral fences stretching out toward grazing land that rolled away to the north. But even from a distance, she could see the neglect. Fence posts leaning, a section of barn roof patched with what looked like canvas, the porch railing broken in 2 places. The garden, if it had ever been a garden, was a rectangle of dry earth and dead stalks. It looked like a place that had been loved once, and then had the love drained out of it. The front door opened as the wagon pulled up, and a girl appeared. Small, thin, brown hair in a braid that was coming undone. She stood in the doorway with her arms at her sides and her eyes wide, watching the wagon with the intensity of a rabbit deciding whether to run. Clara. Behind her, a boy materialized, taller, darker, with his father's jaw and his mother's. Well, Mara didn't know what he'd gotten from his mother, but whatever it was, it sat behind eyes that were already narrowing with suspicion. Jonah. Elias pulled the wagon to a stop. He didn't move immediately. Mara could feel the tension radiating off him like heat from a stove. "Stay here a minute," he said. "Let me talk to them first." She nodded. He climbed down, walked to the porch. She couldn't hear the words. He spoke low, leaning down toward the children, his hat in his hands. She watched the children's faces instead. Clara's didn't change. She just stared, absorbing. Jonah's went through a rapid sequence: confusion, disbelief, and then a hard, bright anger that snapped into his jaw and his fists and the set of his shoulders. "No," she heard. That one word carried clear across the yard in the boy's voice, high and furious. "No, you can't just—" More words from Elias, too low to hear. "I don't care." Jonah's voice cracked. He was 12, still caught between boy and man, and the crack in his voice made the anger sound fragile, like something shouted from the edge of a cliff. "She's not— You can't replace—" Elias put a hand on the boy's shoulder. Jonah shrugged it off violently and disappeared into the house. The door didn't slam only because Clara was still standing in it, and even in his rage, Jonah went around his little sister rather than through her. Clara stayed. She looked past her father toward the wagon, toward Mara. Their eyes met across 30 feet of packed dirt yard. The girl's face held no expression that Mara could name, not hostility, not welcome, not curiosity. Something deeper than all of those. Something that looked like waiting. Elias walked back to the wagon. His face was set hard, but there was a weariness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. "That went about how I expected," he said. "You expected your son to reject me on sight. I expected my son to reject anything that changes how things are, even if how things are is killing us." He reached for her carpet bag. "Come on, I'll show you the house." She climbed down from the wagon. Her boots hit the dirt of her new home. She looked at the sagging porch, the broken railing, the dead garden, the girl standing silent in the doorway. She looked at the vast, lonely landscape stretching in every direction, the hills turning gold in the late afternoon light, the emptiness that went on and on until it met the sky. This was it. This was what she'd traded everything for. Not the tidy life she'd imagined, not the careful plans she'd made, but this: a broken ranch, a grieving family, and a husband who'd married her the way you'd hire a farmhand. She picked up her skirt, walked to the porch, and stopped in front of Clara. The girl looked up at her with those wide, unreadable eyes. "Hello, Clara," Mara said. "My name is Mara. I'm going to be staying here." Clara said nothing, but she stepped aside to let Mara through the door, and in that small gesture, that tiny, almost invisible act of making room, Mara felt something catch in her chest. Not hope. She was done with hope for the day. But maybe something close to it. Something stubborn and quiet and unwilling to die, no matter how many doors closed in its face. She stepped inside the house and did not look back. The house smelled like dust and something burnt, old grease maybe, or bread that had been forgotten in the oven one too many times. Mara stood in the front hallway and took it in. The bones of the place were good. Solid timber frame, real plaster walls instead of bare board, a staircase that swept up to the second floor with a banister that had been carved by someone who cared about the work. But everything on top of those bones was falling apart. Cobwebs hung in the upper corners like gray curtains. The floor hadn't been properly mopped in weeks, maybe months. A pile of boots and coats sat heaped by the door in a tangle that suggested nobody had bothered to sort them since winter. The kitchen was worse. Dishes stacked in the basin, crusted with food that had dried hard enough to need a chisel. A pot on the stove with something dark and unidentifiable dried to the bottom. Flour spilled on the counter and never wiped up, now caked into a paste where water had dripped on it. The pantry door hung open, revealing shelves that were half empty and completely disorganized. Tins mixed with dried beans, mixed with candle stubs, mixed with a pair of work gloves that had no business being there. Elias watched her survey the damage. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, like a man bracing for judgment. "I know it's bad," he said. "It's not good. Sarah, my wife, she kept everything. The house, the garden, the accounts. When she died, I tried. For a while. Then I stopped trying and just started surviving. There's a difference." "I know the difference," Mara said. She opened the pantry wider, mentally cataloging what was there and what was missing. "Where's my room?" He led her upstairs. The hallway had 4 doors. The children's rooms, a washroom, and a small room at the end that faced west. It had a narrow bed with a quilt that was clean but faded, a dresser with a cracked mirror, a window that looked out over the back of the property toward the foothills. The walls were bare. The floorboards creaked under her weight. "This was the sewing room," Elias said. Before. That word was going to come up a lot in this house. She could already tell. Before was a country these people still lived in, even though the border had closed behind them. "It's fine," she said, and meant it. After the storeroom behind the saloon, a room with a real bed and a window felt close to extravagant. Elias lingered in the doorway. "Supper's usually around 6. I'll cook tonight. Give you a chance to settle in." "What do you normally make?" "Beans, salt pork, sometimes eggs if the hens are cooperating." "Every night?" "Most nights." Mara set her carpet bag on the bed. "Show me where you keep the chickens and the root cellar. I'll cook." "You don't have to, Mr. Mercer, if I'm going to live here, I'm going to start living here. Not tomorrow, now." He looked at her for a moment with those river water eyes. Then he nodded and went downstairs without another word. She found eggs in this coop, a sorry-looking coop with wire mesh coming loose and straw that needed changing, but the hens were laying, which was something. The root cellar yielded potatoes that were sprouting but still usable, an onion, a jar of preserved tomatoes that someone, Sarah probably, had put up before the world fell apart. In the kitchen, she found salt, pepper, a tin of lard, and flour that wasn't entirely full of weevils. She cooked. Nothing fancy. Fried potatoes with onion and eggs, tomatoes heated through with salt, biscuits that were dense but edible. The kitchen was a disaster to work in. She had to wash 3 pans before she could use one. The stove drew poorly on the left side, which meant she had to cook everything on the right burner, rotating pans like a juggler. Clara appeared at the kitchen door while Mara was rolling biscuit dough. The girl stood there silently, watching with those enormous brown eyes, her braid now completely undone so that her hair hung around her face in tangles. "Would you like to help?" Mara asked. No pressure. Just the question, offered the way you'd hold out your hand to a skittish animal. Palm up, no sudden movements. Clara didn't answer, but she took 2 steps into the kitchen and stood by the counter, close enough to watch Mara's hands work the dough. "I need someone to grease the pan," Mara said. "There's lard in that tin. Use your fingers. It's faster." Clara looked at the tin, looked at Mara. Then she reached for the lard and began smearing it across the baking sheet with small, careful fingers. She didn't speak, but she stayed. When supper was ready, Mara set the table. 4 plates, 4 forks, 4 cups. She had to search 3 drawers to find napkins. They were cloth, embroidered with small flowers along the edges. Sarah's work. Mara smoothed one with her thumb before laying it beside a plate. Elias came in from the barn smelling like hay and sweat. He stopped when he saw the table. Stopped again when he smelled the food. Something moved across his face that was too complicated and too fast for Mara to read. "Jonah," he called up the stairs. "Supper." Nothing. "Jonah, now." A door opened and closed upstairs. Heavy footsteps, heavier than a 12-year-old should make, as if the boy were deliberately stamping his weight into each stair to announce his displeasure. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at the table, looked at Mara, and sat down in his chair with his eyes fixed on the wall. They ate in a silence so thick Mara could feel it pressing against her skin. The food was adequate. Not great, not terrible, just solid fuel for bodies that needed feeding. Clara ate slowly and neatly. Elias ate like a man who'd forgotten food could taste like anything other than obligation. Jonah ate fast, shoveling it in without looking at his plate, his jaw working mechanically. "This is good," Elias said. It came out stiff, like a phrase he'd rehearsed. "Thank you." More silence. Forks against plates. The creak of chairs. "You don't belong here," Jonah said. The words dropped into the quiet like a stone into still water. Elias's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Clara went motionless. Mara set her own fork down and looked at the boy. He was staring at her now, chin jutted forward, eyes bright with a challenge that dared her to flinch. He had his father's stubbornness and something else, a rawness, an exposed nerve that made the anger look less like hostility and more like pain wearing a mask. "You're right," Mara said. "I don't belong here. Not yet." That wasn't what he'd expected. His eyes narrowed. "You don't belong here at all. This is our house, our family. You're just some stranger who—" "Jonah." Elias's voice was low, a warning. "She is, Pa. She's a stranger. You went to town for grain and came back with a wife. That's not how it works. It's how it worked today." "Well, it shouldn't have." Jonah's voice cracked again, that terrible break between child and man. "Ma wouldn't have wanted this. She wouldn't have wanted some woman from back east coming in here and touching her kitchen and using her napkins and—" "That's enough." "It's not enough. Nothing is enough. You just keep—" Jonah shoved back from the table. His chair scraped against the floor with a sound like a scream. "You keep acting like everything's fine. Like you can just fix it by bringing home some stranger, and it's not fine. It's never going to be fine. And she can't fix it because nobody can fix it because Ma is dead and she's not coming back." The last words came out shattered. Not a shout. Something worse than a shout. The sound of a boy saying out loud the thing he'd been carrying in his chest for 2 years. The thing that sat on him when he slept and rode his shoulders when he worked and whispered in his ear every time he walked past his mother's empty chair. Then he was gone. Out the kitchen door, across the yard, into the dusk. The barn door banged open and shut. Clara was crying, not making a sound, just tears running down her face in silent lines while she stared at the spot where her brother had been sitting. Elias sat rigid in his chair, both hands flat on the table, breathing through his nose. He looked like a man holding himself together through pure force of will, every muscle tensed against the impulse to break. "I'll go talk to him," he said. "Don't." He looked at her. "Not yet," Mara said. "Give him the barn for a while." He said what he needed to say. Let him sit with it. "You don't know my son. I know a boy who just said his mother is dead and started crying about it for maybe the first time. That's not something you fix by following him out there and telling him to settle down." Elias stared at her. His hands were still flat on the table, pressing down so hard his knuckles were white. She could see him fighting it, the instinct to move, to act, to do something with the helplessness that was eating him alive. "Then what do I do?" he asked. And the question wasn't combative. It was genuine. A man standing at the edge of a canyon asking someone, anyone, which direction was safe. You finish your supper, Mara said, and you let me clean up. And in an hour, you go out to the barn and you sit with him. Don't talk, don't lecture, just sit. He picked up his fork, put it down, picked it up again. Ate. Clara had stopped crying. She was watching Mara with an expression that had shifted from blankness to something that might have been the earliest, most cautious form of trust. Like a door cracked open half an inch, just enough to see light on the other side. Mara began clearing the plates. The first week was the hardest thing she'd ever done, and she'd buried both her parents and watched a bank take her family home. The house needed everything: deep cleaning, repair, reorganization. The pantry had to be sorted and half its contents thrown out. The kitchen stove needed its flue cleaned before it burned the house down. The hen house required new wire mesh, which she patched herself using tools she found in the barn and skills she improvised on the spot, pricking her fingers so many times they looked like pincushions by evening. She woke before dawn. She worked until after dark. She scrubbed floors on her hands and knees, beat rugs over the porch rail until her arms ached, washed windows with vinegar and old newspaper until the glass was clear enough to actually see through. She found Sarah's garden plot and cleared the dead growth, turned the soil with a spade that raised blisters on both palms. Elias noticed. He didn't say much. He wasn't a man built for casual conversation. But she caught him looking at the clean windows, the organized pantry, the kitchen that no longer smelled like burnt grease and failure. Once, coming in from the fields, he paused in the doorway and just stood there for a moment as if he'd walked into the wrong house and was trying to reconcile the memory with the reality. You didn't have to clean Sarah's things out of the pantry, he said one evening. She hadn't cleaned them out. She'd organized them, kept what was still good, set aside the personal items she'd found mixed in with the household supplies. A hairbrush, a packet of letters tied with ribbon, a small wooden box with dried wildflowers inside. I didn't throw anything away, Mara said. It's all in a box in the hall closet. The children might want those things someday. He looked at her. Something crossed behind his eyes, deep and fast, like a fish turning in dark water. Thank you, he said. Two words that sounded like they'd been dragged up from somewhere far below the surface. Clara became her shadow. Not all at once. The girl was too careful for that, too scarred by loss to attach quickly. But by the third day, Clara was appearing wherever Mara worked. In the kitchen while Mara cooked. On the porch while Mara swept. In the garden while Mara turned soil. She never spoke. She just watched, absorbing everything with those wide brown eyes, learning the rhythms of this new presence in her world. On the fifth day, Mara was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when a small hand reached up and offered her a clothespin. She looked down. Clara stood beside her, holding the pin with both hands, face solemn as a judge. Thank you, Clara. The girl nodded, reached into the clothespin bag, offered another. They hung the rest of the laundry together in silence, passing pins back and forth, and when they finished, Clara reached up and took hold of Mara's hand for exactly 3 seconds before letting go and walking away. 3 seconds. Mara stood at the clothesline with wet sheets billowing around her and pressed her hand against her chest, and felt something crack open there that she'd been keeping sealed shut since the day she'd arrived in Red Hollow. Jonah was another matter entirely. He didn't speak to her unless forced to. At meals, he addressed his words to Elias or to his plate or to the air approximately 2 feet to Mara's left. When she entered a room, he left it. When she asked him a question, he answered with the minimum number of words that could technically qualify as a response. Yes. No. Fine. Don't know. She didn't push. She had meant what she told Elias that first night, some things you couldn't force, but she made sure Jonah's clothes were mended and his meals were hot, and his bed was made with clean sheets, and when he came in from the fields with cuts on his hands from fencing work, she set the salve and bandages on the kitchen table where he could find them without having to ask her for anything. 2 weeks in, she found the account books. They were in a drawer in Elias's office, a small room off the parlor that had clearly been Sarah's domain based on the handwriting in the ledgers from the years before her death. Those earlier entries were precise, careful, every head of cattle tracked, every expense noted, every seasonal projection calculated with a competence that made Mara's chest ache with recognition. This had been a woman who knew how to run a ranch. After Sarah's death, the entries became Elias's. They were sporadic, messy, often incomplete. Whole months missing, numbers that didn't add up, expenses unrecorded. And the picture they painted, even with the gaps, was alarming. She found Elias in the barn that evening, repairing a stall gate. He worked with a steady mechanical precision that suggested he'd fixed this gate before, many times, because fixing things was easier than facing the things that couldn't be fixed. "We need to talk about the books," she said. His hands didn't stop moving. "What about them?" "You're losing money, more than you probably realize. The feed costs are wrong. You're being overcharged at the lot in town, probably by 20%. You haven't sold any cattle since October, but the herd's been eating through your hay reserve. And there's a tax payment coming due in 3 months that I don't think you have the cash for." Now his hands stopped. He straightened up slowly, a nail still pinched between his fingers. "How do you know about the tax payment?" "It was in the county notice, filed in the ledger. Sarah must have noted it." He flinched at the name, just slightly. A tightening around the eyes, a quick pull of the jaw. But Mara saw it. She was learning to read this man the way you learn to read weather, not from what's obvious, but from the small signs at the edges. "I know about the taxes," he said. "Do you have the money?" "I'll figure it out." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I've got." He went back to the gate, driving nails with sharp, precise blows that sent small echoes bouncing off the barn walls. Mara didn't leave. She leaned against the stall divider and waited. She was learning that about Elias too, that he needed silence the way other people needed prompting. Give him quiet long enough, and things started coming out on their own, like water finding cracks in stone. "I used to have 40 head, he said eventually, not looking at her. "Good stock, well bred. Sarah and I built the herd up from 12 when we first bought this place. Now I'm down to 23, and half of those are getting old. I should have sold last spring when prices were fair, but I couldn't. I couldn't make decisions, couldn't think straight. Everything felt like it was happening behind glass." And now, he drove the last nail, set the hammer down. "Now I've got 23 aging cattle, a ranch that's falling apart, 2 kids who need things I can't give them, and a tax bill I don't know how to pay." He looked at her. "And a wife I married yesterday who's already figured out more about my finances than I have in 2 years. Is that a complaint? It's a statement of fact." He almost smiled. That same half-collapsed expression she'd seen at the feedlot, the structure that couldn't hold its own weight. "Sarah handled all of this. I handled the cattle, the land, the physical work. She handled the money, the house, the children's schooling. We fit together, like 2 halves of something. When she died, it wasn't just grief. It was like losing half my body. I didn't know how to do the things she did, and I was too proud or too stupid or too broken to learn." Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I can help with the books. I can help with the household planning, the budget, the tax situation. But I need you to let me. Actually, let me. Not hand me a ledger and then go back to pretending everything's under control. I never pretended everything was under control. No, you pretended you didn't need help, which is worse." He stared at her. Then he did something she hadn't seen before. He laughed. Short, rough, more bark than humor, but unmistakable. A laugh. "You've got a mouth on you, Mara Whitlock." "Mara Mercer, now. And yes, I do." He shook his head, picked up the hammer, put it on the workbench, stood there with his hands resting on the wood surface, looking at his own scarred knuckles. "All right," he said. "The books are yours. Do what you need to do." She started that night, sitting at Sarah's desk with the lamp turned up and the ledger spread around her. She worked until midnight, then until 1, then until 2, reconstructing the financial picture from fragments and guesswork and the careful records Sarah had left behind like a trail of breadcrumbs through a dark forest. By dawn, she had a plan. It wasn't a good plan. There was no good plan for a ranch this deep in trouble. But it was a plan, and it involved selling 8 head of cattle before the autumn market dropped, renegotiating the feed contract with the lot in town, and taking in mending work from neighboring ranches to cover the gap until the tax bill came due. She showed it to Elias over breakfast. He read it with his coffee going cold in his hand, his eyes moving back and forth across her figures, and he didn't say anything for a long time. "This could work," he said finally. "It has to work. We don't have a second option." Across the table, Jonah was watching. He'd been pretending not to listen, hunched over his plate in his usual posture of determined indifference, but his eyes kept flicking toward the papers in his father's hands. When Elias set them down, Jonah looked away fast. But Mara had seen, and she filed it away. The knowledge that the boy who refused to acknowledge her presence was also the boy who couldn't stop watching what she was doing to save his family. The days settled into something that wasn't quite routine, but was no longer chaos. Mara cooked 3 meals a day, kept the house, tended the garden that was slowly beginning to show signs of life. Green shoots pushing through the soil she'd turned, stubborn little spikes of growth that seemed to mirror something happening inside the house itself. She mended clothes, patched the henhouse again when a coyote tested the new wire, and spent her evenings at Sarah's desk working the numbers. Elias worked the ranch from dawn until dusk. He was out before Mara woke most mornings and came in after the light was gone, smelling like cattle and sweat, and the particular exhaustion of a man doing the work of 3. But things were shifting between them, small adjustments that neither of them named. He started telling her about the ranch, which fence line needed repair, which cattle were showing signs of hoof rot, where the creek was running low. Not asking for help exactly. More like thinking out loud in front of someone he was starting to trust with the shape of his problems. One evening, 3 weeks after the wedding, they sat on the porch after the children had gone to bed. The sky was enormous and full of stars, and the only sound was the wind moving through the sage and the far-off yip of coyotes in the hills. "Can I ask you something?" Mara said. "You're going to anyway." "What was she like?" "Sarah." Elias was quiet for a long time. She could see his profile in the starlight, the hard line of his jaw, the scar, the way his throat moved when he swallowed. "She was better than me," he said, "at everything. At people, at patience, at knowing what the kids needed before they knew it themselves. She could walk into a room and make everyone in it feel like they mattered. I never figured out how she did that." He paused. "She was also stubborn as a fence post, and she argued with me about everything, and she burned cornbread every single time she made it, without fail, for 12 years of marriage." "Every time?" "Every single time. It was a talent. I've never seen anyone so consistently bad at one specific thing." Mara smiled. In the dark, where he couldn't see it. "She sounds real." She was. That's what made it so hard to lose her. She wasn't some perfect memory I could put on a shelf. She was a real person with real faults, and I loved every one of them. And now, they're gone. Mara let the silence hold. Didn't try to fill it with comfort or wisdom or any of the things people say that don't actually help. Just sat with him in the dark and let the weight of what he'd said exist without trying to make it smaller. After a while, Elias stood up. "Good night, Mara." "Good night, Elias." He paused at the door. "The house looks good. I wanted you to know that. It looks like someone lives here again." Then he went inside, and Mara sat on the porch alone and listened to the coyotes and the wind, and she thought about burnt cornbread and imperfect love and the strange, crooked path that had brought her to this chair on this porch. In this place, she was only beginning to understand. Somewhere inside the house, in a room she would never enter, Elias Mercer lay down on the bed he'd shared with his dead wife and stared at the ceiling and thought about the woman sitting on his porch, who'd been in his life for 3 weeks and had already seen more of him than most people saw in a lifetime. He didn't know what to do with that, so he closed his eyes and did what he'd done every night for 2 years. He endured until morning. The fever came in October, when the valley was just starting to turn cold, and the mornings had a bite to them that made the horses stamp and blow steam through their nostrils. It didn't announce itself. It crept in the way trouble always does, quietly, through the back door, while everyone was looking the other way. Mara heard about it first from the supply run. She'd started going into Red Hollow with Elias every 2 weeks, partly to handle the feedlot negotiations herself, and partly because staying on the ranch for 14 straight days, without seeing another face besides the 3 Mercers, was starting to make the walls feel closer than they were. The town still whispered about her. The mail-order bride, the 3 rejections. But the whispers had lost their edge. People had moved on to fresher gossip, and a few of them had even started nodding at her on the street, which in Red Hollow practically counted as a warm embrace. Finnegan told her about it while she was picking up a sack of sugar at the general store, which had changed hands since Harold Sutter married Ruth Ann Briggs and moved to her father's property on the south side of town. "Doc Harlan's been making rounds up the North Valley," Finn said, leaning against the counter with his usual air of knowing more than he should. 3 families down with it already. The Petersons, the Willises, and old Henry Crane's whole household. High fever, sweats, cough that turns wet. Sound familiar? Mara's hand stopped moving on the sugar sack. How familiar? Same thing that came through 2 years ago. Maybe not exactly the same, but close enough that people are nervous. 2 years ago. The fever that took Sarah Mercer. Mara felt the information land in her body before her mind finished processing it. A cold contraction in her chest, a tightening of her fingers on the rough burlap. How bad? Bad enough that Harlan's running out of quinine. Bad enough that the Peterson boy nearly died last Tuesday and his mother's not much better. It's moving south through the valley. Finn paused, and the usual lightness drained from his face. Your ranch is in the path, Mara. She bought extra supplies. Quinine? What little the store had left. Willow bark. Camphor. Clean cloth for compresses. She bought broth bones and dried herbs and a bottle of whiskey that she tucked into the wagon without telling Elias, because he'd ask what it was for, and she'd have to say the words out loud, and saying them would make it real. On the ride home, she told him. He didn't react the way she expected. She'd expected fear, or at least the visible effort of suppressing fear. Instead, his face went blank. Completely, terrifyingly blank. As if someone had reached inside him and turned off every light. His hands kept holding the reins. His eyes kept watching the road. But the man behind the face had retreated somewhere far away to a place where this news couldn't reach him. Elias. Nothing. Elias, look at me. He blinked. Came back slowly, like a man surfacing from deep water. I heard you. We need to prepare. Keep the children close. Boil the drinking water. Keep the house warm but ventilated. If anyone shows symptoms, I know what the symptoms look like. His voice was flat, scraped clean of everything except the bare mechanics of speech. I watched my wife die of them. Mara reached across the wagon seat and put her hand on his forearm. He flinched, not from her touch, but from the contact itself, as if his body had forgotten what it felt like to be reached for. This is not the same, she said. You don't know that. No, I don't. But I know we're not going to sit still and wait for it to happen. He looked at her hand on his arm, looked at her face. Something moved behind his eyes. Not warmth, not yet, but a crack in the blankness, a fissure where something living still pushed through. All right, he said. Tell me what to do. They spent the next 3 days preparing. Mara boiled every drop of water that entered the house. She scrubbed the kitchen and the children's rooms with vinegar until her hands were raw. She made Jonah and Clara wash their hands before every meal, after every trip outside, before touching their faces, a ritual that Jonah submitted to with sullen compliance, and Clara performed with quiet gravity, as if she understood something the adults hadn't explained. Mara kept the children on the ranch. No school. The schoolhouse had already closed, the teacher sent home. No trips to town. No visiting the neighboring spread where Jonah sometimes helped with fencing work for pocket money. The boy fought her on it. I'm not sick, he said, standing in the kitchen with his fists balled, radiating the particular fury of a 12-year-old who believes restrictions are a personal insult. I feel fine. You can't keep me locked up here like I'm some kind of, I can and I will. Pa! Jonah turned to Elias, who was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee and the expression of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. Tell her she can't. She can, Elias said. Jonah stared at his father. The betrayal on his face was almost theatrical. Eyes wide, mouth open, the full pantomime of shocked disbelief. You're taking her side? There aren't sides, Jonah. There's a fever going through the valley, and we're keeping everyone safe. That's it. Ma let me go out when the last fever came through. The silence that followed was absolute. Mara watched Elias's face drain of color. She watched his hand tighten around his coffee cup until the knuckles went yellow-white. She watched him open his mouth, close it, open it again. Your mother, Elias said, and his voice sounded like something being pulled across broken glass, would have given anything to keep you safe. She would have locked every door and nailed every window shut if she thought it would help. Don't use her to argue with me about this. Jonah's chin trembled. The fury crumbled at the edges, revealing what was always underneath, the grief, the fear, the desperate confusion of a child who'd lost the person who was supposed to make the world make sense. Fine, he whispered, and walked out. Not slamming the door this time, just pulling it shut behind him with a click that was somehow worse than a slam. Clara tugged at Mara's sleeve. Mara looked down. The girl's eyes were enormous, full of a question she couldn't or wouldn't voice. "It's going to be okay, Clara." Clara held her gaze for a long, searching moment. Then she nodded, not because she believed it, but because she wanted to, and went back to the wooden puzzle she'd been working on at the table. 4 days passed. 5. A week. No one on the Mercer ranch showed symptoms. Mara started to breathe a little easier. She kept up the precautions, the boiled water, the hand washing, the vinegar scrubs, but the tight knot in her chest began to loosen. Maybe it would pass them by. Maybe this time the luck would hold. On the 8th night, Clara didn't come down for supper. Mara called her from the bottom of the stairs. No answer. She climbed up, knocked on the girl's door, pushed it open. Clara was in bed, still dressed, her face pressed into the pillow. She was shivering. Not the ordinary shiver of a cold room, a deep, rhythmic trembling that ran through her entire body like waves through water. "Clara, Clara, honey, look at me." The girl rolled over. Her face was flushed dark red, and her eyes had a glassy, unfocused quality that made Mara's stomach drop straight through the floor. She touched Clara's forehead. The heat hit her palm like an open oven. For 3 seconds, Mara stood frozen. 3 seconds of pure paralytic terror. The kind that locks your muscles and empties your mind and leaves you standing in a doorway with your hand on a burning forehead and nothing in your head except the word no, repeated over and over like a bell tolling in an empty church. Then the 3 seconds ended, and she moved. "Elias!" He was at the foot of the stairs in seconds. He took them 2 at a time, and when he came through Clara's door and saw his daughter's face, he made a sound Mara had never heard before. A low, choked noise that came from somewhere deep in his body, from the place where the memory of his wife's death lived and breathed and waited. "No," he said. "No, no, no. Elias, Elias, stop. I need you here. I need you with me right now." He was gripping the doorframe so hard the wood creaked. His face had gone the color of ash. She could see him leaving, not physically, but the same withdrawal she'd seen in the wagon, the retreat to that far-off place where reality couldn't touch him. She grabbed his arm, hard, fingers digging in. "Don't you dare. Don't you leave me alone with this. I need water boiled. I need the quinine from the pantry. I need every clean cloth in this house brought up here. Now, Elias, right now." Something in her voice, the sharpness of it, the absolute refusal to accommodate his collapse, pulled him back. He blinked, focused on her, nodded once. "Water," he said, "boiled, and the quinine." He went. Mara turned back to Clara. The girl was coughing now, a dry, harsh cough that rattled in her chest like something shaking a cage. Mara eased her upright, propped pillows behind her, began unbuttoning the girl's dress to get her into a nightgown. "I don't feel good," Clara whispered. 2 words, the most she'd said at once in months, and they came out thin and scared and small. "I know, sweetheart, I know. We're going to take care of you." "Am I going to be like Mama?" The question hit Mara like a physical blow. She stopped with her hands on the girl's collar, and for a moment, just a moment, her composure cracked and something raw showed through. She pressed it back, sealed it over, looked Clara in the eyes. "No, you are not going to be like Mama. I'm going to be right here, and I'm not going anywhere, and we're going to fight this. Do you hear me?" Clara's burning hand found Mara's and held on. Elias came back with water and quinine and an armful of cloths. Behind him, Jonah appeared in the hallway, his face white. "What's wrong with her?" "Your sister has a fever," Mara said. She was already mixing quinine into a cup of water, measuring by instinct and memory. Her own mother had dosed fevers this way, back in Pennsylvania, in a kitchen that smelled like lemon peel and dried lavender. "Jonah, I need you to keep the fire going downstairs, all night. Don't let it die." "Is she going to be okay?" "Jonah, the fire." He looked at Clara, looked at the flushed face and the shivering body and the glassy eyes, and something in his expression collapsed. The anger, the hardness, the wall he'd built between himself and everything that frightened him. It fell away and left a 12-year-old boy looking at his little sister and seeing the thing he feared most in the world. "Go," Mara said, gently now. "Keep the fire going. That's the most important thing you can do for her right now." He went. She heard him on the stairs, and for the first time his footsteps sounded like what they were, a child's, light and fast and frightened. The night that followed was the longest of Mara's life. Longer than the night in the storeroom behind the saloon. Longer than the night she'd sat beside her mother's bed and watched the breathing slow and stop. This was different. This was a child. Not hers by blood, barely hers by law, but hers in every way that mattered, because she'd hung laundry with this girl and cooked beside her and felt those small fingers hold hers for 3 seconds on a windy afternoon. And those 3 seconds had sealed something between them that no legal document could touch. The fever climbed. By 10 o'clock, Claire was delirious, mumbling words that didn't connect, fragments of songs, her mother's name, something about the chickens that made no sense. Her skin was so hot that the wet cloths Mara pressed to her forehead dried within minutes. The cough deepened, turning wet and thick, and every time Clara drew breath there was a rattling sound beneath it that made Elias flinch as if he'd been struck. He sat on the other side of the bed, holding Clara's hand, his face a mask of controlled agony. He'd stopped talking, stopped responding to anything Mara said. He was there in body but somewhere else entirely. Back in this same room, maybe. Or one like it, 2 years ago, watching another person burn. Elias, I need you to hold her up. He moved mechanically, lifting Clara's shoulders while Mara tipped quinine water between the girl's cracked lips. Most of it dribbled down her chin. Some went in. Mara wiped her mouth, adjusted the compress, checked the girl's breathing. Talk to her, Mara said. What? Talk to her, your voice. She needs to hear it. Tell her she's going to be all right. I can't. I don't. Then tell her about the ranch. Tell her about the horses. Tell her about her mother's garden, the one I'm replanting. Tell her anything, Elias. Just keep talking so she knows she's not alone. He swallowed hard, looked at his daughter's face, opened his mouth. The mare had her foal last spring, he said. His voice cracked on the second word. You wanted to name her Biscuit, remember? I said that was a terrible name for a horse, and you just looked at me the way you do when you've already decided something. So Biscuit it is. He paused, drew a ragged breath. She's getting big now, almost ready to ride. And Mara planted sunflowers in Mama's garden. They're not up yet, but she says they'll come in spring. You're going to see them, Clara. You're going to see the sunflowers. Mara worked through the night. She rotated compresses every 15 minutes. She mixed quinine and willow bark tea and spooned it between Clara's lips in tiny amounts, patient as erosion. When the cough turned so thick that Clara couldn't breathe, Mara propped her forward, rubbed her back in long, firm strokes, and held a bowl beneath her chin while the girl coughed up fluid that was tinged with blood. That was the worst moment. The blood. Elias saw it and made that sound again. That deep animal noise of a father watching his child suffer. And Mara looked at him across the bed with the bowl in her hands and said, She's still breathing. Focus on that. She is still breathing. At midnight, Jonah came upstairs. He'd been stoking the fire for hours, and his face was streaked with soot and tears he was pretending weren't there. Can I sit with her? Mara nodded. He pulled a chair to the bedside and sat, and he took Clara's other hand, the one Elias wasn't holding, and he held it with both of his, those rough 12-year-old hands that had been doing a man's work for 2 years, and he didn't say anything. He just held on. At 2 a.m, Clara's fever spiked. Her body arched off the bed, rigid, trembling violently, and for 30 seconds Mara thought they were losing her. She pressed Clara flat, held her shoulders down, shouted at Elias to hold her legs, and they fought the convulsion together, Shabab, physically, bodily, as if they could hold the girl to the earth by sheer force of grip and will. The convulsion passed. Clara went limp. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, like a rabbit's. We need the doctor, Elias said. The doctor is 20 miles away, and it's the middle of the night. Then I'll ride. And leave her. Leave the ranch. I can't just sit here and watch her. His voice broke. Fully, completely broke, like a dam that had been holding for 2 years and finally gave way. I can't do this again, Mara. I can't sit in this room and watch another. I can't. She moved around the bed. She took his face in her hands. His cheeks were wet, and he was shaking, and his eyes were wild with a terror that had nothing to do with the present and everything to do with the past. You listen to me, she said. This is not the same night. I am not leaving this room. That girl is going to live because I'm going to keep her alive, and you are going to help me. Not by riding off into the dark, by staying, right here, with your daughter, with me. He stared at her, the wildness in his eyes slowly, Not smoothly, not cleanly, but in ragged increments, pulled back from the edge. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay. Okay." She went back to work. Fresh compresses. More quinine. Willow bark tea, cooled to lukewarm, administered drop by drop. She pulled the blankets off when the fever spiked and piled them on when the chills came. She listened to Clara's breathing the way a sailor listens to the wind, reading every shift and rattle and pause for information about what was happening inside the small body fighting for its life. Jonah fell asleep around 3, his head on the edge of the mattress, his hands still wrapped around Clara's. Mara draped a blanket over his shoulders and let him sleep. Elias stayed awake, red-eyed and hollow, handing Mara whatever she needed before she asked for it: water, cloths, the quinine bottle, the basin. At some point in the darkest hours, when the lamp was burning low and the house was silent except for Clara's labored breathing, Elias said, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone who'd try for a while and then give up." "I don't give up." "I see that." 4 o'clock came. 5. The window began to lighten, not with sun yet, just the faintest dilution of the darkness, the sky turning from black to the deepest possible blue. Claire's breathing hadn't changed. The fever held, stubborn and relentless, a siege that showed no sign of breaking. Mara's hands were shaking, not from exhaustion, from the sustained effort of keeping the fear locked in its cage while she did the work that fear wanted to prevent. She was running out of quinine. The willow bark was gone. She'd used every clean cloth in the house, and the bowl of water she was dipping compresses into had turned lukewarm and needed replacing. She was about to send Elias for fresh water when Clara coughed. Not the wet, rattling cough of the night. Something different, drier, looser, the sound of lungs that were clearing instead of filling. Mara pressed her hand to the girl's forehead. The heat was different. Still there, still alarming, but the quality had changed. The burning intensity had softened to something that felt more like a coal dying down than a fire building up. She checked again. Pressed her wrist to Clara's temple the way her mother had taught her. Held it there for 10 seconds, 15, 20. "Elias." He was beside her in an instant. Feel her forehead. He reached out, touched his daughter's skin, and the sound he made this time was different from every other sound she'd heard from him. A sharp intake of breath, like a man who'd been underwater for too long, finally breaking the surface. "It's dropping," he said. "It's dropping." Clara stirred. Her eyes opened. Not the glassy, unfocused stare of delirium, but something clearer, something that recognized the faces leaning over her. She looked at her father. She looked at Mara. She looked at Jonah, asleep with his head on the mattress, and a small, fragile line appeared between her brows. "Why is everybody in my room?" she whispered. Elias made a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and all the way broken. He pressed his forehead to his daughter's hand and he stayed there, shoulders shaking, while the dawn came through the window in thin bands of gold and gray. Mara sat back in her chair. Her hands were still trembling. Her dress was soaked with sweat and compress water and the faint blood that had come up during the worst of the coughing. She felt hollowed out, scooped clean, like a gourd that had been emptied to make room for something new. Jonah woke up, lifted his head, saw Clara's open eyes, and the face he made, the raw, unguarded relief of a boy who still had his sister, was the most honest expression Mara had seen from him since the day she'd arrived. He looked at Mara, not through her, not past her, not at the air 2 feet to her left. He looked directly at her, and in that look was something that hadn't been there before. Not gratitude exactly, not acceptance, something more elemental than either. The recognition that she had fought for his family with everything she had through the worst night of their lives, and she had not left. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Mara stood up. Her legs nearly buckled. She'd been sitting for 8 hours, and her body was reminding her of every one of them. She steadied herself on the chair back, crossed the room, and stood at the window. Outside, the ranch lay in the early morning light. The barn, the corral, the garden she was bringing back to life. The hills beyond, golden brown in the dawn. A hawk circling slow and high over the valley, riding thermals that carried it in wide, patient loops. Behind her, Elias was murmuring to Clara, his voice low and broken and tender. Jonah was sitting very still, holding his sister's hand like it was the most precious thing he'd ever touched. The fever had broken, the family was still here, and Mara Whitlock, Mara Mercer stood at the window with her trembling hands pressed against the cold glass and let herself feel, for the first time since she'd climbed down from that stagecoach in Red Hollow, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Clara's recovery was slow and uneven, full of setbacks that tested every nerve Mara had left. The fever broke that first morning, but it didn't stay broken. It came back in smaller waves over the next 4 days, each one weaker than the last, but still enough to send Elias to the doorway of his daughter's room with that look on his face, that terrible bracing, like a man standing on a railroad track watching the light approach. Mara handled it. She didn't handle it gracefully or calmly, or with any particular wisdom. She handled it the way you handle a fire you can't outrun. You stay close, and you fight, and you accept that you're going to get burned. She slept 2 hours a night, sometimes 3, curled in the chair beside Clara's bed with a blanket over her shoulders and the quinine bottle in arm's reach. She ate when Elias put food in front of her, and sometimes not even then. By the 3rd day, her hands had a tremor she couldn't control, and her reflection in Clara's window looked like a woman who'd aged 5 years in a week. But Clara was getting better. Each wave of fever was shorter, milder. The cough loosened and then faded. The color returned to her face, not all at once, but in patches, like a garden coming back after drought. On the 5th morning, she sat up in bed on her own and asked for eggs. Mara went downstairs and cooked eggs and cried into the skillet while they fried, and when she brought the plate up, her face was washed and dry and steady. Here you go. Scrambled, because that's all I trust myself to do right now. Clara took the plate, ate half of it, then looked up at Mara with those brown eyes that held so much more than a 9-year-old should have to carry. "You stayed," Clara said. "Of course I stayed." "The whole time." "The whole time." Clara set the plate on the bedside table. She reached out and took Mara's hand, not the way she had at the clothesline, that quick 3-second touch and release. This time she held on and didn't let go, and her grip was surprisingly strong for a girl who'd been burning with fever 2 days earlier. "Mama went to sleep and didn't wake up," Clara said. The words came out matter-of-fact, the way children sometimes deliver devastating truths, without drama or decoration, just the bare architecture of the thing that broke them. "I kept waiting for her to wake up. Papa said she couldn't, but I kept waiting." Mara squeezed the girl's hand. Her throat was so tight she wasn't sure she could speak. "I was scared I was going to go to sleep and not wake up too," Clara said. "But you were always there when I opened my eyes, every time." "Every time," Mara said. "And I'll be here tomorrow, and the day after that." Clara nodded. Something shifted in her face, a letting go, a release of tension she'd been carrying so long it had become invisible, like a wall that had been standing so long you forgot it was a wall and not just part of the landscape. She let go of Mara's hand, picked up her eggs, and went back to eating. It was the most Clara had spoken in 2 years. Word spread through the valley the way word always does in small places. Not through newspapers or announcements, but through the accumulated weight of one person telling another, until the story has traveled 20 miles in 3 days and picked up details along the way, some true and some invented, and all of them carrying the same essential shape. The Mercer girl had caught the fever. The new wife, the mail-order woman, the one nobody wanted, had fought it through the night, had saved the child. People started coming by the ranch. Not many, and not with any great ceremony, but enough that Mara noticed. A rancher's wife from the next spread over brought a pot of stew and stood on the porch talking to Elias for 20 minutes. The Peterson family, their own boy recovered now, sent a crate of preserved peaches with a note that just said, "Thank you for showing us all what courage looks like." Even the feedlot man, who'd never said a word to Mara beyond the minimum required for a transaction, tipped his hat the next time she came into town and called her Mrs. Mercer in a voice that held something it hadn't before. Mara didn't know what to do with any of it. She'd spent her entire time in Red Hollow being the woman people whispered about, the punchline, the cautionary tale. Being looked at with something other than pity or amusement felt foreign, like wearing a coat that didn't quite fit but was warmer than anything she'd owned before. "You're famous," Finnegan told her, grinning behind his bar counter. "The whole valley's talking about you." "I didn't do anything special. I just didn't leave." "Yeah, well, in my experience, not leaving is the most special thing a person can do." She thought about that on the ride home, thought about it while she cooked supper and while she mended Jonah's work shirt and while she sat at Sarah's desk going over the account books. Not leaving. Such a simple thing, such an impossibly hard thing depending on the night. The change in Jonah didn't happen all at once. Nothing with Jonah ever happened all at once. The boy was too stubborn for that. too committed to the walls he'd built, too afraid that taking them down would mean admitting they'd been unnecessary all along. But the walls were coming down, stone by stone, in moments so small Mara almost missed them. The first was 2 days after Clara's fever broke. Mara was in the kitchen making bread, real bread, not the dense biscuits she'd been producing since she arrived, because she'd finally gotten the stove's left burner drawing properly and the oven held heat the way it was supposed to. Jonah walked in, headed for the back door, and stopped. "Smells different," he said. "I fixed the flue." "Huh." He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, looking at the dough on the counter. Ma used to make bread on Wednesdays. It was the first time he'd mentioned his mother to Mara without using her as a weapon. Just a fact. A memory offered with open hands instead of clenched fists. "What kind?" Mara asked. "Wheat, mostly. Sometimes she'd put in dried apples if we had them." "I've got dried apples in the pantry." He looked at her. The defensive squint was there, the habitual suspicion, but it had lost its edge. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to. I'm asking if you'd like me to." A beat, 2. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." She made wheat bread with dried apples that afternoon, and when she set it on the supper table, Jonah ate 3 slices without saying a word, and his silence was the loudest compliment she'd ever received. The second moment came a week later. Mara was in the garden. Really a garden now, not just a plot of turned earth, because the seeds she'd planted were coming up in tentative rows of green that seemed to get bolder every morning. She was on her knees, pulling weeds, when a shadow fell across her. Jonah stood there with a spade in his hand. He didn't say anything, just knelt down beside her and started digging, loosening the soil around the seedlings the way someone who'd watched his mother garden 100 times would know to do. They worked side by side for an hour. Neither of them spoke. When they finished, Jonah stood up, brushed the dirt off his knees, and said, "She'd have liked what you're doing with it." Then he walked away, and Mara sat in the dirt with tears running down her face and a spade in her hand, and a feeling in her chest like something that had been locked for a very long time was finally turning open. The third moment was the one that broke her. It was a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the fever. Clara was fully recovered, back to her quiet routines, helping Mara in the kitchen, following her around the ranch, occasionally saying a few words that landed like small gifts in the silence. Jonah had started joining them at the supper table without the theatrical resentment, eating and sometimes even participating in something that almost resembled conversation. Elias was complicated, but that was a different matter. Mara was washing dishes when she heard Jonah's voice from the parlor. He was talking to Clara, and he didn't know Mara could hear through the kitchen wall. "I was wrong about her," he said. Clara's voice still quiet but stronger now. "About Mara?" "Yeah, I don't know what I thought. That Pa was trying to forget Ma, like he was replacing her, but that's not what happened." "What happened?" Jonah was quiet for a moment. "She came here because she didn't have anywhere else to go. And she stayed because, I don't know, because she wanted to, because she actually cares about the ranch, about you." A pause. "About all of us. She saved me." "I know. She was there every time I woke up." "I know, Clara." More quiet. Then Jonah's voice again, smaller now, stripped of the hardness and the bluster and the 12-year-old armor he'd been wearing like a second skin. "I miss Ma. I'm always going to miss Ma. But that doesn't mean I have to be mean to Mara. It's not... Being mean to her doesn't bring Ma back. It just makes everything worse." "I like Mara," Clara said. "Yeah," Jonah said. "I think I do too." Mara stood at the kitchen sink with her hands in soapy water and her eyes closed and her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She didn't move. She didn't make a sound. She stood there and let those words find their way into the empty spaces inside her. The spaces left by 3 rejection letters, and a storeroom cot, and a town that had laughed at her, and a lifetime of being told, in ways large and small, that she wasn't enough. She was enough. Those 2 children in the parlor had just told each other she was enough, and they didn't even know she was listening. Elias was the last wall standing, and he was the hardest one to read. In the weeks after Clara's fever, something had shifted between them. Shifted, not resolved. He was more present at meals, more likely to tell her about the ranch, more willing to sit on the porch after the children were in bed and exist in her company without the rigid discomfort of those first weeks. He'd even started asking her opinion on ranch decisions, which cattle to sell, when to start the winter preparations, whether to invest in new fencing or patch the old. But there was a boundary he maintained with absolute consistency, a line drawn in the air between them that he refused to approach. He never touched her, never used her name in the soft way he sometimes said Clara's or Jonah's, never looked at her the way she occasionally caught herself looking at him, with curiosity and something warmer than curiosity, something she didn't have a name for yet and wasn't sure she wanted to name. The marriage was what he'd promised it would be, a business arrangement, a legal framework, two people sharing a house and a life and a family without sharing the thing that made it more than logistics. And then one evening in late November, with the first real cold settling over the valley and the fire burning in the parlor and the children asleep upstairs, Elias said her name in a way he hadn't before. Mara. She looked up from the account book she was reviewing. He was sitting across the room in the chair by the fire, his hands resting on his knees, his face half in shadow and half in light. He looked like a man who'd been working up to something for weeks and had finally run out of reasons to postpone it. "I need to say something to you," he said, "and I'm probably going to do a poor job of it because I don't have the words for this. I never have. Sarah used to say I could talk to a horse for an hour but couldn't tell my own wife what I was feeling for 30 seconds. Mara closed the account book, set it on the desk, gave him her full attention. "When I married you," he said, "I told myself it was practical. Just a solution to a problem. The ranch needed someone. The kids needed someone. I needed someone, even though admitting that felt like a betrayal of everything Sarah and I had built." He paused, rubbed his hands together, the calluses catching. "But that night, the fever. When I thought we were going to lose her and I was falling apart, and you grabbed my face and told me to stay." He stopped, swallowed. The firelight caught the scar on his jaw and the wetness gathering in his eyes. "Nobody's ever done that for me. Nobody's ever looked at me in the worst moment of my life and told me to stay. When Sarah was dying, I was alone. The doctor had gone home. The neighbors had left. I sat in that room by myself and I held her hand and I watched her go, and there was nobody. Nobody." His voice splintered. He pressed his knuckles against his mouth, hard, the way you press a hand against a wound. Mara stood up from the desk. She crossed the room and sat in the chair beside his, close enough that their knees almost touched. She didn't reach for him, didn't try to close the distance he'd maintained so carefully. Just sat there, present, the way she'd sat beside Clara's bed through the longest night of her life. "You asked me once what Sarah was like," Elias said. "And I told you she was better than me at everything. That was true. But here's what I didn't say. What I couldn't say because I didn't understand it yet. She was the best thing in my life, and losing her nearly killed me. But you came into this house like someone walking into a burning building. You didn't know us. You didn't owe us anything. You had every reason to walk away, and instead you stayed and you fought, and you saved my daughter's life, and somewhere in the middle of all that, you—" He looked at her, directly, fully, with the walls down and the gates open and everything he'd been carrying for 2 years visible in his face, like a landscape after snow melts. "You became the heart of this family, Mara, and I don't want a business arrangement anymore. I don't want a legal framework. I want to do this properly. I want to be your husband. Not on paper, for real." The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, a coyote called and another answered. The wind pressed against the windows with a sound like breathing. Mara looked at this man. This stubborn, broken, honest, infuriating man who'd married her the way you'd hire a farmhand and was now sitting across from her with his heart in his hands, clumsy and terrified and more real than anything she'd ever been offered in her life. "You're doing a terrible job of this," she said. "I told you I would. You didn't even ask." He blinked. "Didn't ask what?" "You told me what you want. You didn't ask what I want." A beat. He straightened in his chair. Something that might have been the beginning of real fear crossed his face. The fear of rejection, of putting yourself forward and being turned away, of standing at a feedlot in the noon sun while a woman with a carpetbag decides your fate. "What do you want, Mara?" She let the question sit for a moment. Not to torture him. To feel it. To hold the weight of someone asking her what she wanted. Genuinely asking, with the intention of honoring the answer. "I want to stop sleeping in the sewing room," she said. The relief that broke across his face was messy and imperfect and entirely human. Not a smooth transformation, but a crumbling, like a cliff face giving way to reveal something green and alive underneath. He reached for her hand. She gave it. His fingers closed around hers, rough and warm, and shaking slightly, and he held on the way Clara had held on during the fever, like someone who'd found something worth gripping in the dark. "Okay," he said. "Okay." Neither of them moved. They sat there in the firelight, holding hands like a couple of awkward teenagers, and the absurdity of it. Two grown adults who'd been married for months, who'd survived a crisis together, who'd built something real out of nothing, sitting there too nervous to do anything more than hold hands, would have been funny if it hadn't been so exactly right. "I'm going to be a difficult wife," Mara said. "You've been a difficult wife since the minute I met you. And you're going to be a stubborn, uncommunicative husband who buries his feelings under ranch work and pretends everything's fine. Probably. And I'm going to call you on it every time." "I know you will." She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and the coyotes called again, closer now, their voices carrying across the frozen valley like songs in a language only the land understood. Later that night, much later, after the fire had burned to coals, and the house had settled into the deep silence of a home where everyone is safe and sleeping, Mara lay awake in the dark of a room that was no longer the sewing room, listening to Elias breathe beside her. Steady, even breaths. The breathing of a man who was, for the first time in 2 years, sleeping without the weight of the world on his chest. She thought about the 3 letters in her coat pocket. Still there, still folded, still carrying the promises of men who hadn't been brave enough or decent enough to keep them. She'd carry those letters for a while longer, not as wounds, not as reminders of failure, as evidence. Proof that the worst day of her life had been the first step toward the best thing she'd ever found. Tomorrow she'd make breakfast. She'd check the accounts. She'd work in the garden, tend the chickens, help Clara with her reading, argue with Jonah about his chores, negotiate feed prices, patch whatever fence had fallen down overnight. She'd do the 1,000 ordinary things that made up a life. And she'd do them in a house that was starting to feel like it belonged to her. Not because anyone had given it to her, but because she'd earned it, board by board, meal by meal, night by terrible night. She closed her eyes. Sleep came easier than it had in months, settling over her like a quilt. Not new, not perfect, but warm, and hers, and enough. Winter came hard that year, the way it always did in the High Valley. Not gradually, but in a single decisive assault, as if the weather had been waiting behind the mountains for the right moment to announce that comfort was over. The first real snowfall arrived in early December and buried the ranch under 2 feet of white in a single night. Mara woke to a world transformed, the familiar landscape erased and rewritten in a language of silence and cold. She stood at the bedroom window, their bedroom now, hers and Elias's, though sometimes in the early mornings she still caught herself reaching for the edge of the narrow cot in the sewing room before remembering where she was, and watched the snow settle over the barn, the corral, the garden she'd coaxed back to life. All of it hidden, all of it waiting beneath the surface for spring to call it out again. Elias was already downstairs. She could hear him building up the fire, the rhythmic thud of logs and the scrape of the iron poker. He woke before she did every morning, not because he was a better early riser, but because his body still carried the habits of a man who'd spent 2 years running from sleep, from the dreams that lived there, from the empty pillow beside him. Those habits were fading now, slowly, the way a scar fades, never fully gone but less vivid with each passing month. She dressed and went down. The kitchen was warm, the stove already throwing heat, and Elias had put the coffee on. He looked up when she came in, and the way his face changed, not a smile exactly, but a softening, a loosening of the tension he wore like armor, still caught her off guard. She wasn't used to being the thing that made someone's face go gentle. "Snow's deep," he said. "I noticed. Fence line on the north pasture might be buried. I'll have to dig out the posts before the cattle push through." After breakfast, he agreed. 3 months ago, he would have gone out without eating, driven by the compulsion to work until his body gave out because working was easier than feeling. Now he sat at the table and drank his coffee and waited while Mara fried eggs and sliced bread. And when she set the plate in front of him, he said, "Thank you," in a way that meant more than the food. Clara came down in her nightgown, her hair a tangle, a book clutched under one arm. She'd been reading voraciously since the fever, as if the silence that had held her for 2 years had been replaced by an insatiable hunger for words, for stories, for the sound of language doing things she hadn't been able to make it do herself. She read everything Mara gave her and then asked for more, and Mara had started ordering books through the general store in town, spending money the ranch could barely afford on volumes that felt more essential than feed or flour. "Morning, Clara." "Morning." Clara slid into her chair, opened the book, and began reading while she ate. A bad habit, technically. Mara let it go. There were worse things a 9-year-old could do than read at the breakfast table. Jonah came down last, stomping snow off his boots in the hallway. He'd already been to the barn to check on the animals, a routine he'd taken on without being asked, the kind of quiet responsibility that told Mara more about who this boy was becoming than any words could have. "Horses are fine," he said, dropping into his chair. "But the water trough is freezing over. We need to break the ice twice a day at least." "I'll handle the morning," Elias said. "You take the afternoon." "Okay." Jonah reached for the bread, paused, looked at Mara. "Can you make the apple bread today?" "If we have the dried apples." "We have them." "Thanks." Such a small exchange. A boy asking his stepmother to make bread. But Mara felt it. The weight of what that request carried, the distance it had traveled from the night Jonah had shoved back from the table and screamed that she didn't belong. Every time he asked her for something, bread, a mended shirt, help with a arithmetic problem he'd never admit he was struggling with, it was another stone removed from the wall, another inch of ground reclaimed from grief and stubbornness and fear. The winter passed the way winters do on an isolated ranch, in long days of work and short days of light, in the rhythm of feeding animals and breaking ice and keeping fires burning, in evenings spent together in the parlor while the wind threw itself against the walls like a living thing trying to get inside. Mara read aloud to Clara most nights while Jonah pretended not to listen from his corner of the room, and Elias mended tack or sharpened tools, and the fire crackled and the clock ticked, and the family existed together in a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was during one of those evenings that Jonah said it, not dramatically, not with any build-up or preparation. Just said it, the way you say something that's been sitting on your tongue for weeks, and finally slips out when you're not guarding against it. Mara was reading, a passage about a boy and his dog on the frontier, something she'd chosen for Clara, but that Jonah had been tracking with obvious interest from behind his whittling, and she paused to turn the page. In the silence, Jonah looked up from his work and said, "Mama, can you read that last part again? I missed what happened to the dog." The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Mama. Not Mara, not her or she, or the careful absence of any name at all. Mama. Jonah froze. His hands stopped moving on the wood he was carving. His face went through a rapid sequence of expressions. Surprise, then alarm, then a flush of embarrassment that started at his neck and climbed to his ears. He looked at Mara with an expression that was half defiance and half terror, as if he'd accidentally revealed something he'd been hiding even from himself. The room was very quiet. Clara had stopped fidgeting. Elias's hands were still on the piece of tack he'd been mending. Mara looked at the boy, at this stubborn, angry, tender, grief-stricken boy who had fought her presence with everything he had and was now sitting in a chair across from her with the word "Mama" hanging in the air between them like a bridge neither of them had planned to build. "The dog got lost in the canyon," she said, turning back to the book. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. "But he follows the river, and the river leads him back." She kept reading. Jonah picked up his whittling. Clara leaned against Mara's shoulder, and Elias, across the room, looked at his wife with an expression that held so many things: gratitude and love and grief and wonder, and the particular ache of watching your broken family put itself back together in ways you never expected. That no single word could have contained it. Nobody mentioned what Jonah had said. Nobody needed to. It sat among them like a new piece of furniture. Unfamiliar, a little awkward, but clearly meant to stay. After that night, Jonah used the word sparingly, carefully, as if testing its weight each time. Not every day, not in every context. But when it mattered, when he needed comfort, or was hurt, or wanted to share something that felt too important for formality, the word was there. Mama. And each time he said it, Mara felt it land in the same place inside her, that space she'd been keeping sealed since the day she arrived in Red Hollow, the space that was now wide open and full of something she hadn't known she was capable of holding. Spring came late, but it came with force, the snow melting fast enough to turn the creek into a river, and the road to town, into a muddy trench that swallowed wagon wheels up to the axles. The garden exploded. Mara's sunflowers, the ones she'd planted in Sarah's plot, the ones Elias had told Clara about during the fever, came up tall and bright and reckless, turning their faces toward the sun with an enthusiasm that bordered on aggression. Clara claimed them as her own and spent hours in the garden with them, talking to them in a quiet voice that was growing stronger and more confident by the week. The ranch was healing too. Mara's financial plan had worked, not perfectly, not without tension, but the 8 cattle they'd sold before winter brought enough to cover the tax bill with a narrow margin left over. The feedlot contract had been renegotiated at a fair price, partly because the new owner of the general store, a sensible woman from Oregon who'd bought out Harold Sutter's remaining inventory, had pointed Mara toward a second supplier in the next valley who was willing to compete for the business. The mending work from neighboring ranches brought in small but steady income, and Mara had started taking in laundry as well, turning the ranch's big kitchen into a workroom on Tuesdays and Thursdays, while Clara helped with folding and Jonah hauled water without being asked. The account books were clean now, precise. Every cent tracked, every expense justified, every seasonal projection calculated with the same careful competence that Sarah's handwriting had shown in the older ledgers. Mara didn't think about that comparison often. She wasn't trying to be Sarah, wasn't trying to fill the outline of a woman she'd never met. She was trying to be Mara, doing the same work in her own way, with her own handwriting and her own method. And if the results looked similar from a distance, that was because competence has its own grammar, regardless of who's speaking it. The tax payment was the occasion for her first real confrontation with the town since the day she'd arrived. She rode in alone. Elias was dealing with a fence break on the north pasture, and Jonah was helping him, and she tied the horse at the land office and went inside to pay. Horace Trimble was still behind the desk, still smelling of pipe tobacco, and he looked up when she entered with a recognition that held none of the discomfort of their last meeting. "Mrs. Mercer, what can I do for you?" "Tax payment, Mercer Ranch, full amount." She set the money on the counter. Bills and coins counted out precisely, because precision was its own form of dignity. Horace counted it, recorded it in the ledger, stamped the receipt, and handed it back to her. "Ranch doing all right?" he asked. "Ranch is doing fine." "Glad to hear it. You folks had a rough go of it." She was about to leave when the door opened behind her and Ruth Ann Briggs, Ruth Ann Sutter now, walked in. Harold's wife, the woman he'd chosen over Mara, the woman with the dowry and the local family and the feedlot father. She was pretty in a round, comfortable way, with blonde hair pinned up under a bonnet and a complexion that suggested she spent most of her time indoors. They looked at each other. The moment held a charge that everyone in the room could feel. Horace suddenly very interested in his paperwork, the clerk finding urgent business in the back room. "Mrs. Mercer," Ruth Ann said. Her voice was polite, careful, the voice of a woman who knew the history and was navigating it with the caution of someone crossing a frozen creek. "Mrs. Sutter," another beat. Ruth Ann clutched a leather folder against her chest. Harold and I heard about your daughter, about Clara, what you did during the fever. I wanted to say, I'm glad she's all right." Mara studied the woman's face. There was no malice there, no smugness, just the awkwardness of someone standing in front of the woman her husband had discarded, trying to be decent about it. "Thank you," Mara said. "I appreciate that." Ruth Ann nodded, hesitated. Then, in a lower voice, "For what it's worth, I think things worked out the way they were supposed to, for all of us." Mara considered that. Considered the strangeness of this moment, standing in a land office in a town that had laughed at her, facing the woman who'd gotten the man Mara was supposed to marry, and feeling not a trace of envy or resentment, because Ruth Ann was right. Not in the cosmic sense, not in any grand design, just in the plain, practical sense that the path Mara had ended up on, the ranch, the children, Elias, was better than anything Harold Sutter could have offered her. Not easier, not smoother, but better, in the way that matters. "I think you're right," Mara said, and meant it. She walked out of the land office into the spring sunshine and untied her horse and rode home, and the ride felt different than it had before. The road that had once stretched in front of her like a sentence with no end now felt like a road she knew. Every rut, every curve, every landmark pointing her toward a place she belonged. That evening, sitting on the porch after supper with Elias beside her, and the children's voices drifting through the open windows, she told him about meeting Ruth Ann. "How was that?" he asked. Strange. Fine. She was trying to be kind. And were you kind back? I was civil. There's the difference. She paused. I don't resent her. I don't resent any of them. Sutter, Garvey, Pratt. I used to. On that first night, in the storeroom behind the saloon, I lay there and I hated every single one of them. I hated them for being cowards, for making promises they couldn't keep, for treating me like something disposable. And now? Now I think they were just people. Flawed, scared, ordinary people who made decisions they probably regret. Sutter married Ruth Ann because it was easy. Garvey caved to his mother because he was weak. Pratt ran to California because he was afraid of commitment. Those are human failings, not crimes. And if any one of them had kept his word, I wouldn't be here. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he reached over and took her hand, the way he'd started doing in recent weeks. Not tentatively, not with the careful restraint of those first months, but with the easy assurance of a man who'd stopped being afraid of needing someone. I'm glad you're here, he said. I know you are. Even when you argue with me about the cattle? Especially when I argue with you about the cattle. You're wrong about the South Pasture rotation, by the way. I am not. The numbers don't lie, Elias. I've shown you the feed consumption charts 3 times. Charts, he said, with the particular disdain of a man who trusted his gut over a ledger. Sarah never needed charts. Sarah would have made charts if she'd had an extra hour in the day. I've seen her notes. She was moving in that direction. He looked at her. The mention of Sarah's name between them had changed over the months. No longer a flinch, no longer a wound being touched, but something closer to a shared memory. Not Mara's memory, not directly, but a shared understanding that Sarah Mercer had lived and loved and left a mark on this family that would never fully fade. And that was all right. Mara didn't need it to fade, she just needed room beside it. She would have liked you, Elias said. I've thought about that a lot. She would have liked your stubbornness. She would have liked the way you don't back down. She would have absolutely hated the way you reorganized the pantry. The pantry was a disaster. It was organized by intuition. It was organized by chaos. He laughed. A real laugh. Not the short bark she'd heard that day in the barn, but a full, genuine, slightly rusty laugh that sounded like a door being opened after a long time sealed shut. It was the best sound Mara had ever heard, and she wanted to live inside it. The summer brought growth of every kind. The cattle gained weight on the summer grass. The garden produced more than the family could eat, and Mara started selling vegetables at the general store in town, adding another small stream of income to the ranch's improving finances. Clara turned 10 and celebrated with a cake Mara baked and decorated with wildflowers from the garden. Jonah grew 2 inches and started needing new boots every few months, a development he announced with a mixture of pride and annoyance that was so perfectly adolescent it made Mara want to laugh and weep at the same time. The ranch itself was transforming. Elias and Jonah replaced the broken porch railing, re-roofed the barn with proper shingles instead of canvas patches, mended the corral fences that had been sagging since before Mara arrived. She painted the front door, a deep green that stood out against the weathered wood of the house like a statement of intent. This is a home. People live here. People who plan to stay. Finnegan came out to visit in August, driving a borrowed cart loaded with supplies and a bottle of whiskey he presented to Elias with the gravity of a diplomatic gift. He sat on the newly repaired porch and looked at the ranch, the clean windows, the tended garden, the sunflowers blazing against the fence, the laundry drying on the line in the mountain breeze, and he shook his head. You know, he said to Mara, when you walked into my saloon that day, I figured you'd last maybe a week, no offense. Some taken. I gave you the storeroom key because I felt sorry for you. I thought you were the saddest thing I'd ever seen. This woman from Pennsylvania standing there with her carpet bag and her 3 rejection letters, trying not to cry in front of a room full of drunk ranch hands. I wasn't trying not to cry. I was refusing to cry. There's a difference. Finn smiled. Yeah, I see that now. I see a lot of things now that I didn't see then. He looked out at the garden, the hills, the vast sky. This is a good place, Mara. You built a good place. We built it, all of us. Sure, but someone had to start the building. Someone had to walk onto this ranch with nothing and decide that nothing was enough to work with. He raised his glass. To the woman nobody wanted. Look at her now. Finn. What? Shut up and drink your whiskey. He did, laughing, and Elias came around the corner of the barn with Jonah behind him, both of them dusty and sweating from fence work, and Clara appeared on the porch with her book and her braid coming undone the way it always did, and for a few hours on a summer afternoon, the ranch held all the people Mara loved in one place, and the feeling was so full and so sharp that it almost hurt. The way sunlight hurts when you've been in the dark for a long time and your eyes haven't adjusted. The letter came in September. It was addressed to Mrs. Mara Mercer, Red Hollow, Montana Territory, in unfamiliar handwriting, and it arrived with the monthly mail delivery that the post-rider brought from the county seat. Mara opened it at the kitchen table while Clara practiced her letters beside her, and Jonah was somewhere outside being 13 and difficult about it. The letter was from a woman named Agnes Pyle, writing from a town in Nebraska. She'd heard about Mara, heard the story, the version of it that had traveled the way stories travel through frontier communities, passed from ranch to ranch and town to town like a seed carried by wind. 3 rejections. A marriage of necessity. A family saved by a woman who had nowhere else to go. Agnes Pyle was 23 and alone. Her husband had died of cholera 6 months after their wedding, leaving her with a small inheritance and no prospects. She was considering answering a mail-order advertisement but was terrified. She'd heard about women who traveled west only to find disappointment, abuse, abandonment. She wanted to know, was it worth the risk? Could a woman build a life from nothing on the frontier? Was there hope at the end of the road, or just more road? Mara read the letter twice. Then she sat at the kitchen table for a long time, looking at the handwriting of a stranger who was standing at the same crossroads she'd stood at 2 years ago, asking the same questions, carrying the same fear. She got out pen and paper and began to write. She didn't sugarcoat. She didn't romanticize. She told Agnes the truth, that the frontier was hard, that men were unpredictable, that rejection was possible and loneliness was certain, and there were no guarantees of any kind. She wrote about Red Hollow, about the storeroom behind the saloon, about the 3 men who'd failed her. She wrote about Elias and the children and the fever and the night she'd fought for Clara's life with nothing but quinine and stubbornness and the absolute refusal to let another person she cared about slip away. And then she wrote this. You ask whether it's worth the risk. I can't answer that for you. Every woman's road is different, and I'd be lying if I told you mine didn't nearly break me. But I'll tell you what I've learned, for whatever it's worth. The things that look like endings are sometimes beginnings wearing a disguise so convincing you'd never recognize them until you've walked far enough down the road to look back and see the shape of what they were. The 3 men who rejected me didn't ruin my life. They cleared a path I couldn't see at the time, a path to a family that needed me as much as I needed them, to a place where my work mattered, to a love I didn't plan for and couldn't have imagined. That doesn't make the rejection hurt less. It doesn't make the fear disappear. But it does mean that the worst moment of your life might not be the defining moment. You get to decide that. Not the men who fail you, not the towns that mock you, you. She sealed the letter and sent it with the next mail delivery. 3 weeks later, she received a reply. Agnes Pyle had decided to go west. She was frightened but resolved. She thanked Mara for the honesty and the courage and the willingness to share the truth instead of a fairy tale. After that, the letters kept coming. Not from Agnes alone, from others, women who'd heard the story, who'd gotten Mara's name from someone who knew the mail-order bride from Red Hollow who'd turned rejection into a ranch. They wrote from Nebraska and Kansas and Oregon and California, from small towns and isolated homesteads and crowded boarding houses and cities where a woman alone was either invisible or prey. They asked the same questions Agnes had asked, and Mara answered everyone. She answered them at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, by lamplight, with Elias reading beside her and the fire dying to coals. She answered them honestly, without sentimentality, with the hard-won clarity of a woman who'd walked through the worst of it and come out holding something worth keeping. She told them that the frontier would test them, that they would face cruelty and indifference, and moments of despair so complete they'd wonder why they'd bothered. And then she told them that the testing wasn't the point, that they were more than what happened to them. That the only failure that mattered was the decision to stop trying. Elias watched her write those letters with an expression she'd come to recognize, the quiet pride of a man watching someone he loves do something that matters, mixed with the faint bewilderment of a man who still couldn't quite believe his luck. How many this week? He asked one evening. 4? 4 women writing to a stranger for advice. They're not writing to a stranger. They're writing to someone who's been where they are. Still, he set his book down. You know what you're doing, right? You're building something, not just here on the ranch, out there. You're telling these women that their lives aren't over because some man said no. That's not nothing, Mara. It's just letters. It's never just letters. She looked at him. This man who'd married her at a land office without flowers or music, who'd spent weeks avoiding her eyes and months learning to hold her hand, who'd broken apart during his daughter's fever and been put back together by a woman he'd known for less than a season. He was imperfect in 1,000 ways. Still stubborn, still prone to silence when he should speak, still inclined to trust his instincts over her charts, still carrying a grief for Sarah that would never fully dissolve and shouldn't. He was difficult and reserved and not always easy to love. She loved him anyway, not because he was easy, because he was real. "Come to bed," she said. One more chapter. Now Elias, he closed the book, followed her up the stairs, and in the quiet of their room, with the Montana night pressing against the windows and the children sleeping down the hall, they existed together in the simple, complicated, imperfect way that two people who've chosen each other exist. Not in a story, not in a fairy tale, but in the daily, unremarkable miracle of showing up. Years passed. Not smoothly. Years never pass smoothly, no matter how much you want them to. There were bad winters and dry summers, and a year when the cattle got sick, and Mara sat at the account books for a week trying to figure out how to cover the veterinary bills. There were arguments, real ones, the kind where voices got raised and doors got shut and someone slept on the parlor sofa, which was always Elias because Mara refused to give up the bed on principle. There were setbacks and disappointments and days when the ranch felt less like a dream and more like a grind. But the family held. That was the thing. Through all of it, the family held. Jonah grew into a young man who had his father's stubbornness and his mother's, his first mother's, gentleness and something entirely his own, a quiet competence that made people trust him before they knew why. He took over more of the ranch work as Elias's back started giving him trouble, and he did it without complaint, because somewhere between the boy who'd screamed, "She's not coming back," and the young man who called Mara Mama without thinking about it, he'd learned that work done for people you love isn't work at all. Clara became a reader, then a writer, then the first person in the Mercer family to talk about going to school. Real school, beyond what Mara could teach her at the kitchen table. She was still quiet, still more comfortable with books than with crowds, but the silence that had swallowed her after her mother's death had been replaced by a selective, deliberate thoughtfulness. She spoke when she had something to say, and when she spoke, people listened. And Mara became the thing she'd never set out to become. Not the mail-order bride, not the woman nobody wanted, not even the woman who'd saved the Mercer girl during the fever, though people still told that story, embellished now with details that hadn't happened and a heroism she would have denied. She became the woman who wrote the letters. The ranch became known, not just in Red Hollow, but across the territory and beyond, as a place where women could come. Not a boarding house, not a charity operation, but a way station. A place where a woman traveling west on uncertain terms could stop, rest, eat a meal, get honest advice from someone who'd been through the fire, and leave with something more valuable than directions or supplies. She left with the knowledge that failure wasn't fatal, that rejection wasn't a verdict, that the worst thing that could happen to you might be the first chapter of the best story you'll ever tell, if you're stubborn enough to keep turning pages. Mara never planned it. It grew the way gardens grow, from small seeds planted with modest expectations, nurtured by consistent attention, fed by an accumulation of days spent doing the same essential work. One letter became 10. 10 became 50. And somewhere along the way, the ranch on the hill outside Red Hollow became a landmark in the lives of women who needed to know that starting over was possible. On an evening in late summer, one of those evenings when the Montana sky goes the color of peaches and the light stretches out long and gold across the valley, and the air smells like sage and warm earth and the particular sweetness of a day that knows its ending. Mara stood on the porch of the ranch she'd helped build, and she looked out at the life she hadn't expected. Elias was beside her, his shoulder touching hers, his hair fully gray now at the temples, his face more weathered than the days she'd met him, but his eyes, those river water eyes, alive in a way they hadn't been when she'd first seen them over a pile of grain sacks at the feedlot. He carried himself differently now, not lighter exactly. Elias Mercer would never be a light man, but more settled, more present, as if the weight he carried had shifted from a burden to a ballast, something that kept him grounded instead of dragging him down. Clara was in the garden, kneeling among the sunflowers, which had grown taller than she was. She was 17 now, and she was writing in a journal she kept, filling pages with words that flowed from her pen with a fluency that still surprised Mara, who remembered the silent child standing in the doorway, wordless and watching. Jonah was coming up the road from the lower pasture, leading a horse, moving with the easy confidence of a young man who knew his land and his work and his place in the world. He raised a hand in greeting when he saw them on the porch. 20 years old, broad-shouldered, capable, carrying himself with a steadiness that his 12-year-old self would not have recognized. "Fence is fixed," he called out. "North pasture's holding." "Thank you, Jonah," Mara called back. "Apple bread tonight? If you bring me firewood." "Deal." He grinned. That flash of warmth that still reminded her, every time, of the first moment he'd looked at her without hostility. That terrible night by Clara's bed, when the walls came down and the boy behind them was finally visible. Elias reached over and took her hand. A gesture so familiar now that it required no thought, no negotiation, no courage. Just the easy, worn-in habit of two people who'd been holding on to each other long enough that letting go would feel like losing a limb. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The storeroom." "What storeroom?" "Behind the saloon, where I slept my first night in Red Hollow." He was quiet for a moment. "That was a long time ago. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Other times it feels like it happened to someone else entirely." "You're not the same person." "No, I'm not." She looked at him. "Neither are you." "No," he agreed. "I was a mess when you met me." "You were a disaster." "That's harsh." "It's accurate. You were eating beans every night, your books were a wreck, and your barn roof was held on with canvas and false hope. And now your barn has a proper roof, your books are immaculate, and you eat apple bread." He smiled. The full version, not the half-collapsed thing she'd seen those first weeks. A real smile, creased and warm and lived in. The smile of a man who'd learned that happiness doesn't arrive as a finished product. It arrives as raw material, rough and unformed, and you build it into something with your hands and your days and the people you choose to build it with. "I have a question," Mara said. "Go ahead." "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't walked up to you at the feedlot?" Elias considered this. "I'd have gone back to the ranch with my grain sacks, eaten beans, let the books get worse, let the barn roof fall in." He paused. "I'd have lost the ranch eventually, probably within the year, and then I'd have lost the kids because I couldn't have taken care of them without a home. And then I'd have lost myself because there wouldn't have been anything left to hold me together." "That's a bleak picture." "It's an honest one. You asked." Mara squeezed his hand. "For what it's worth, I was terrified. Walking up to you, I'd been rejected 3 times in one day. My entire plan for the future had collapsed. I had no money, no prospects, and a carpetbag full of broken promises. And I was about to propose a business arrangement to a complete stranger because a bartender with a mustache told me it might work." "Thank your bartender for me." "I already have. Multiple times." The sun was dropping behind the western hills, painting everything in shades of amber and copper and deep gold. The valley stretched out below them, broad and patient and enduring. The same valley that had been here before them and would be here after. Indifferent to the small human dramas played out on its surface, but willing to hold them all the same. Clara closed her journal and walked up from the garden, sunflower petals caught in her hair. She climbed the porch steps, leaned against the railing, and looked at her father and Mara with the calm, knowing expression of a young woman who understood more about the world than most people twice her age. "I'm going to apply to the teaching college in Helena," she said. Elias blinked. "When did you decide that?" "I've been thinking about it for months, but I wanted to be sure before I said anything." "And you're sure?" "I'm sure. I want to teach. I want to do what Mara did for me. Help children who've lost their words find them again." Mara looked at this girl. This woman, really, though she'd always be a girl in some corner of Mara's heart, and felt something rise in her chest that was too large and too tangled for a single name. Pride and grief and joy and the bittersweet recognition that the people you raise are not meant to stay. They're meant to go, to carry the things you gave them into the world and build something new with them. And the best you can hope for is that what you gave them was enough. "I think that's a wonderful idea," Mara said. "You won't miss me too much?" I'll miss you terribly, and I'll write you every week, and you'll come home for summers. And apple bread? Always apple bread. Clara smiled, a wide, open, unguarded smile that held no trace of the silent child who'd stood in a doorway and watched a stranger step into her life. She hugged Mara, then her father, then disappeared inside to tell Jonah, whose voice carried through the walls a moment later. Helena, that's 3 days' ride. Who's going to help me with the fencing? Mara laughed. Elias shook his head. The ordinary noise of family filled the house. Complaints and excitement, and the clatter of someone opening the pantry, and over it all, Clara's voice, talking, the voice of a girl who had spent 2 years in silence and would never waste another word. The evening settled around them. The sky went from gold to pink to deep violet, and the first stars appeared, faint and uncertain, as if testing whether it was safe to come out. The valley darkened. The coyotes started up in the hills, their voices carrying across the distance in long, wavering calls that meant nothing and everything: territory, hunger, loneliness, the simple compulsion to make noise in the dark so something out there might hear you and answer. Mara sat on the porch she'd swept on her first morning as a mercer, on the ranch she'd helped save from collapse, in the family she'd joined as a stranger and now anchored as its heart. She thought about all the women she'd written to, Agnes Pyle and the others, scattered across the frontier, each one carrying her words in a pocket or a drawer or a corner of their memory, each one making a decision that would shape the rest of her life. She hadn't told them it would be easy. She'd told them it would be worth it. Not the same thing. Not even close. But the difference between those two ideas, between easy and worth it, was, Mara thought, the difference between the life you plan and the life you get. The life you plan is clean and logical and follows a straight line from intention to outcome. The life you get is messy and crooked and full of wrong turns that somehow lead to the right place. If you keep moving, if you refuse to stop, if you pick up your carpet bag one more time and walk toward the next unknown thing with your back straight and your jaw set and your eyes open to whatever comes. 3 men had said no. 1 man had said yes. And everything that mattered, every meal cooked, every fence mended, every account balanced, every fever fought, every hand held, every word spoken into the silence of a child who needed to hear that she was safe, had grown from that single, imperfect, unromantic yes, spoken at a feedlot in the noon sun by 2 people who were too stubborn and too desperate and too human to do anything other than try. Elias's shoulder was warm against hers. The porch boards creaked beneath them. Inside the house, their children were arguing about something, their voices rising and falling in the familiar cadence of people who loved each other enough to fight about things that didn't matter. Mara leaned into her husband's shoulder. He leaned back. They sat together in the gathering dark, 2 people who'd found each other by accident and kept each other by choice, and they watched the last light fade over the land they'd built their lives on. Not a perfect life, not a smooth one, but a life that was theirs, earned and scarred and standing, and more than either of them had dared to hope for on the day they'd shaken hands beside a wagon full of grain sacks and decided to try. The prairie night closed around them, vast and quiet and full of stars, and the ranch on the hill above Red Hollow stood solid against the dark. Not a monument, not a symbol, just a home. A place where a woman who'd been told she was nothing had built everything that mattered, one ordinary day at a time. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was the whole story.